evening, everybody. Lovely to see you. I'm Sarah, the Chief Executive. So actually, Neil has just done all of the housekeeping, so there's no need for me to do that this evening. But wonderful to be here again for the lecture. I actually missed the last one, and I think the lecture series this season has been fabulous. Is tonight our last one? Yeah. So we're finishing with the best. Oliver is a dear friend of mine. I've known him for a long time, and what Oliver doesn't know about historic buildings and architecture, nobody knows. So it's a real pleasure for us to have him here this evening. Now, a word of warning: he's not timed his talk because he just told me, and we do have to go on the dot at 8:15 because I have to get Ollie back onto a train. So there will be time for Q&A at the end, I hope. But if you don't get a chance to ask the questions you'd like to, you can email, and we will make sure that Ollie gets back to you.
Then I can use Wikipedia as well.
Yes, yeah. So over to you, Ollie.
Thank you very much, everyone, so much for coming tonight. And it amused me very much to be called doctor, because I'm certainly not a doctor. Oliver Cox is, and I'm not, I'm afraid. I'm a very lowly master of nothing. But anyway, it's great to be here in this wonderful house. Last time I was here, I was actually singing here, so it's nice not to be this time. So Wentworth Woodhouse, I thought I would just do a sort of plonk it in its setting, really, architecturally, because we all know this house relatively well, I'm sure. Or if you don't, it's such a welcoming place that one can learn so much from just visiting it. So I'm going to be talking around it a bit, really, and exploring the domestic architectural world that it's sat in. So here it is, this extraordinary house of almost of mythical proportions, extraordinary size, a house that is a good and bad fortune in equal doses, a house that overall has been a great positive thing in this area of England, and a house of two distinctly different faces. Indeed, Wentworth Woodhouse really is two houses back to back. And if you haven't been around to the west side of the house, it's a completely different building. And the earliest of these edifices is this side of the house here, the Baroque house, which is ornate stone and red brick structure facing west. And it was built from 1725 by Thomas Watson Wentworth, later Lord Moulton, replacing the earlier Jacobean house of the first Earl of Strafford. The architect was Ralph Tunnicliffe, and it looked over a charming Giardino Segreto. I'm terrible at pronouncing things, so that was meant to be Italian, not Welsh or something. Anyway, a secret garden. The Baroque house was very much a statement of swagger and grandeur, which really Baroque architecture is really always that, and that's why it's mainly suited for large buildings or bordellos, perhaps. But it's sort of there's not much. It's not very good sort of in between. And so we're going to now go to the locality, well, Derbyshire, which is where I'm from, and actually, no, we're not going to see this first. Sorry, this is looking closer up of the West Front here. Often in Baroque buildings, particularly abroad, you'll see that there are a great sort of concave centres or convex. Here at Wentworth Woodhouse, it's quite a flat facade, actually, when you actually see it from the side like that. And when you look at it from the front, the sculptural effect of the stonework gives it added depth. And Baroque architecture really was all about theatre and tricking the eye. But here you see it with the long gallery wing sticking out there. So this is Sudbury Hall in Derbyshire. And have anyone been there? Yes? Well, it's National Trust, and the estate is still owned by some of the Vernon family as well. And it's a really very, very important house. It reached international fame by being Pemberley for the 1995. The inside of Pemberley, Lime Park was the outside. So as a style, the British Baroque style really only took flight in relatively few instances. So we're going to go back a little while here, just to hear the beginnings of the Baroque style in country house building in England. Up until the advent of early 18th century country Baroque houses, the style was largely contained in ceilings and in rarer instance was allowed to make some mark on the walls, but it was very much contained, this Baroque style. If you go into mainland Europe, the Baroque architecture completely dominates the buildings built in the style. But here in England, as ever, we're slightly reticent and modest, and also we weren't keen on Catholics at the time particularly, so Baroque was very Catholic. I think it was St John Smith Square in London with its 4 towers. I think Queen Anne said it's nothing but a footstool or the wrong way around. So up until the advent of the early great 18th century Baroque houses, really there was no great explosion of Baroque. So here we see Sudbury Hall in Derbyshire, built for the Vernon family between 1660 and 1680. It is at the same time Tudor Gothic as well as Baroque in style, and it's got, for example, this diaper work, this darker bricks on the red, which you see at places like Hampton Court, so very much a sort of 16th century thing. Great mullioned and transomed windows here, and it's an E-shaped house, which of course everyone associates that with Queen Elizabeth, but this house here is built in 1660, so well after that period, and at a time where you think just a few years later, the fully fledged Baroque is happening. But this is a very odd house. It's on purpose trying to be a throwback. Modern touches are brought in with the Œil de Boeuf windows sort of here, these little oval windows on the first floor above the main mullion windows. And of course, in this magnificent centerpiece and the cupola above. So very, very Baroque features in the center of the house here, but very much contained in the center. So the Vernon is saying, look, I understand the Baroque, but I'm not really convinced. I still want to have a house that's, paying more homage to the Elizabethan prodigy houses, which is, they were called that because they were prodigiously large. So this is trying to look like an Elizabethan Jacobean prodigy house, but actually this is really a Baroque house, but it's not a proper Baroque house yet. So I've not really explained it very well. But the center of it here, it might as well be 2 Christopher Wren reredos on top of each other. And then we go inside. A sumptuous staircase, repainted by John Fowler white. It was wooden before. It's quite controversial, but actually it's lovely because you see the Baroque detailing, all these great sort of swags and fruits and wreaths and things. Very, very sumptuous, but relatively stiff. And painted classical panels in bulky Baroque frames. You see the ceiling of the staircase. Again, that Baroque exuberance, the painting is contained within a frame. And then on the right, the ceiling of the long gallery by Bradbury and Pettifer. Up-to-date decoration, but in an extremely old-fashioned room for the 1660s to build a long gallery. It's, again, completely out of date. So again, the Baroque style in England is always fighting tradition and people wanting to pull back. The English are always saying, come on, let's be a bit daring, but then go back into what's comfortable. So these rooms are old-fashioned, really, and here is a self-conscious attempt to hark back to the days after the Restoration. So this is happening at a similar time. This is Belton House in Lincolnshire, which I'm sure some people have been to as well. Again, National Trust, a little bit later than Sudbury, up to date and far more fluently classical, but it is restrained, very, very restrained. And if you think of Vaux-le-Vicomte in France, a similar, a sort of contemporary house in a way. Look at the English build a lovely, calm doll's house. The French build some marvelous domed sort of palace. The English seem to allow themselves to be taken up by the exuberant and wild so long as they can recover in familiar territory. Painted detail, as mentioned at Sudbury, just in small cases, was one way which Baroque interiors could assume a new sense of magnificence, space, and perspective. The painted rooms at Burghley House in Lincolnshire, which would have been one of the grandest examples in private hands, illustrate the English Baroque at its most imaginative. On the left, you've got the Bow Room, recently relit by TM Lighting, who are brilliant, painted by Louis Laguerre in 1697. So we're just on the verge of the 18th century now, depicting scenes from the life of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and the conduct of Scipio and the mythological gods and goddesses representing the planetary systems. It all sounds a bit over the top, but that's the Baroque. Laguerre's father-in-law was Jean Tijoux, the celebrated blacksmith or ironsmith who made some of the great ironwork at Chatsworth. Of course, I don't know whether he did some of the Baroque stuff here, but anyway, he was the sort of the big man of the time. And you see here again the Baroque ceiling contained in its frame, but what Burghley shows is these magnificent schemes where the Baroque painting and architecture comes right into the room with this trompe-l'oeil painting. And the most famous of all of the rooms at Burghley, and one of the great Baroque rooms in England, the Heaven Room, painted by Antonio Verrio, another one of the great sort of royal painters, really. And next door actually is the hell staircase, which shows a giant cat as the gaping mouth of hell. He obviously hated cats. And in here, actually, there is a, annoying, you can't quite see it, but there's a self-portrait of him, actually. It's just about there. A self-portrait of Verrier. He put himself there at the forge, I think Vulcan's forge. So that is the heaven room, but a very good example of the grandeur of Baroque. And when you think of the Baroque wing of Wentworth Woodhouse, imagine a little bit of that sort of going on inside, because of course this house was updated and that this went out of fashion. Two of the grandest Baroque palaces in England were the work of Sir John Vanbrugh, with a lot of help from his very talented comrade Nicholas Hawksmoor. So this is Blenheim Palace, a house which probably vies with this house for size. Wentworth Woodhouse would probably say it's larger, but I don't know whether it is as big as Blenheim. Bigger. It's bigger than Blenheim. Okay, there we go. It's bigger than Blenheim. It's all just swagger. Blenheim was built from 1705, so we're getting closer to our date of Wentworth now. Its exterior is surely the grandest of all the great English aristocratic palaces of the time, far grander indeed than anything the royals were building. And of course, there was a lot of sort of slight mistrust of the monarchy still by this time. So if you want to see the great houses, the great palaces of England, people from abroad will say, well, Buckingham Palace is quite grand, but you know, where's the Versailles and all this stuff? And actually, our Versailles are the houses of the aristocracy, like Blenheim, and of course, like Wentworth Woodhouse. So it's typical of British modesty that this most splendid of Baroque palaces that was built not for the monarch, but for a soldier of relatively humble birth who became the first Duke of Marlborough. Blenheim Palace is on the exterior the most stupendous and prodigious of all the country houses of the early 18th century. And it's clear to see why this sort of architecture, with its indiscriminate use of classical vocabulary, just willy-nilly all over the place, so annoyed the Palladians who came to build the central block here. And here is Castle Howard, a few years before, from 1701, so just a similar time to Blenheim. And Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor created this wonderful palace, and the first private house to have a great dome plonked on top of it. I mean, that must have been such an extraordinary thing to do, but again, it would have annoyed certain people because this daring conceit inside looks much more like a church than a house. And you can imagine what, you know, it's a great Catholic palace, really, like a church, but it's in a house. It's bizarre. And this would not at all be out of place if you said this was a church in Venice, but it's a country house hall. And you contrast this with a similarly grand hall here at Wentworth Woodhouse, and that is the difference really between the Baroque and the Palladianism. The imagination is slightly reined in, I feel. So this hall is in the center of Castle Howard, theatrical, dazzlingly rich and mysterious in its use of space. Stone stairs weave in and out of these great arches here behind, and there's a lot of imagination and spatial mystery to a Baroque interior, which the Palladians don't go in for so much. So by the dawn of the Georgian era, so with 100 years of changes in style had occurred in British architecture and design. The 17th century had begun in the same vernacular vocabulary of the preceding years, which was largely Gothic and homegrown. So the masons in the, you know, all over England, apart from perhaps in London, where maybe they were most up to date, really Gothic, that vocabulary remained their vocabulary right up really to the early 19th century. By the middle of the late 17th century, the classical style had reached prominence and had self-assuredness that was informed by examples seen and studied in Italy by Inigo Jones and his followers. By the last quarter of the 17th century, the Baroque style had started to make itself known, as we see here. But due to national reticence as well as a fear of papal connotations, the movement had failed to be embraced in the way it had been on the continent. Unlike the Gothic and the loosely classical styles, Baroque architecture did not translate so well down the scale to humbler houses and public buildings, so that is also why it didn't take on so much here. So, as ever, the British like to go from one extreme to the other, and such is the change from the bombastic Baroque to the purity of Palladianism. And this shows perfectly here at Wentworth Woodhouse a lovely example of this great change. Here we see on the left a very Baroque, exuberant, wild doorcase in the west wing, and then the view from the portico are Flitcroft's extremely cool and calm Palladian east front. And hardly just a handful of years separates these two phases of architecture. The Georgian era has become synonymous with a joyful sense of cohesion in the arts. By 1714 and the first George, we find change in the air. George I inherited at the age of 54, barely spoke English, and was much happy in his castle at Herrenhausen in Hanover. These long absences in Germany and lack of involvement in the arts led to a major shift in the cultural landscape, from the court to the landed nobility. The Baroque style had failed to dominate interiors, apart from in the grandest instances like we've seen, and a purity of classical design became fashionable. Great architects of the British Baroque, including James Gibbs, who built, for example, Derby Cathedral nearby, went from being overtly Baroque to strictly classical, correct, as Palladianism swept all before in this new rule of taste. So here we see, obviously, the orders which govern everything really in classical architecture. The Palladians saw them through the eyes of Palladio, the Renaissance architect. So they really sort of regarded him as a sort of god. And Colin Campbell was arguably the most influential style changer of the early Georgian era. And he rejected the continental Baroque. The work of Bernini was seen to be affected and licentious. He wrote that Inigo Jones, the great man who swept everything, as he said, he outdone all that went before and proved that in most we equal and some things even surpass our neighbors. And Inigo Jones brought Palladianism to England, really. And then Christopher Wren embraced it, but then the Baroque. And so Inigo Jones was our idea, our Palladian architect, if you like. He was our Palladio. And Palladianism had numerous laws. Andrea Palladio, who was born in 1508, so such a long time ago, was thought to embody the divine principles of proportion, Palladianism, proportion of the human body, and then from God himself. And even the humblest wall referred to a grand classical column. And so even on this I think was made for the film, wasn't it? But was this made for the bookcase here? Sarah, was that made for the film? Or maybe that was here. Yes. But anyway, okay, if we look at this room here, it's very similar to here. You've got obviously the dado rail or the chair rail, then you've got up to the cornice, and here's exactly the same. And what it's referring to, I've put the column on the left to show you that's what this is referring to, with the plinth, the pedestal, and then the column, and then the architrave above. So these Palladian principles would govern a small room in a townhouse right up to a great palace. And this is a house called Rainham Hall in London, which was built in 1729. So just a little bit after the West Wing here. Vitruvius Britannicus, a book published 1715, celebrated the slick, symmetrical and stylish new country houses that were in all cases directly influenced by the classical world and Renaissance Italy. This isn't Wentworth Woodhouse. It does look quite like it, minus the dome. This is Wanstead House, built from 1715 to 1722, close to London, and a sedate and stately essay in Palladianism. And if you think about how different this is to Castle Howard with its dome, you know, Castle Howard is sort of throwing energy everywhere and it's beautiful, pretty and exuberant. This is suddenly very calm, collected, and quite a cool building. And even the cupola looks sort of quite reined in. So Palladianism and Wanstead burst onto the scene as a reaction to the former Baroque exuberance of great houses such as Blenheim, and indeed the other range of this house here, the red brick range there. Wanstead was a very large house with a hexa-style portico, like we have here, and a palatial piano nobile. So this first floor, the rustic floor there in Palladian architecture. So that's the sort of the rude floor, you know, i.e. not rude as in something naughty happens there, but it's sort of the working floor, and then the piano nobile above the dust and the noise and the mess. And of course, in this house, you enter through into the hall of many pillars. That's in the rustic level, or you go right into the marble saloon on the piano nobile. The tall first floor here seen so perfectly, and this is so similar to Wentworth Woodhouse. The heavily incised stonework on the lower floor is known as rustication, which of course you see here. It almost gives it a slightly defensive air. The relative simplicity of the architecture hardly seems novel today, but it was the simplicity that made Wanstead and the early Palladian houses such a catalyst for change. Here was a style that would work as well with a small villa as a great palace, for a gate lodge or a provincial townhouse. And this is why the Georgian style has remained popular and widespread. The idea of the piano nobile was used, as seen here, of course, in a very magnificent form, but perhaps in the grandest possible form at Wentworth Woodhouse. And of course, it's been massively elongated. And I was just with Sarah outside and amused by actually how small the proportions of the wings are, just to make it look even bigger. But there you see, Wanstead House is pretty much in the center of Wentworth Woodhouse. And as at Wanstead, a huge hexa-style portico, double portico, leads to the piano nobile rooms and the marble saloon beyond. And here we go again. Inside, it is hard to believe that just 10 years separates these two building phases at Wentworth Woodhouse. A doorway on the east wing began in 1725, and a photo of the enfilade above here in Henry Flitcroft's west wing of around 1734. And an enfilade, the idea of the interconnecting chambers, comes from the French court, really Versailles, and the idea of the importance, the root of importance through a building. So ironically, like at Chatsworth, the enfilade ends in the smallest room. So if you were invited into the smallest room at the enfilade, you were most important. Most people, I'd probably be out there somewhere. Most people, so it was like a sort of retinue. But anyway, that's the lovely enfilade here at Wentworth Woodhouse. But the difference, Baroque and Palladianism, is really nicely done by these. And here, of course, is Whistle Jacket Room. Somewhere over there, half a mile over there. Exuberant Baroque style here, in some ways, really, teamed with Roman style arabesques. The funny thing about Palladianism was that the interiors often do refer to the Baroque and use quite a lot of Baroque elements. So it's a mixture of purity, but also retaining some of what had gone before. The overmantel here has a very wacky pediment, a sort of swan's neck type pediment. And the panels are Rococo in style. So the idea of grotto like Rococo, racaille, shell decoration, very, very exuberant again, but it's much finer than the Baroque. It's again contained in panels. So we go from boom to it's contained again. The European Rococo style emerged as a reaction against the strict geometric style of Louis XIV. And it had more of an effect on furniture, silver, and porcelain in England than it did on entire decorative schemes. The Rococo style in England was restrained when compared to what was going on, of course, in parts of Europe, the racaille style. And then a purely Palladian space with a grand coolness that we've come to expect, the marble saloon, 60 foot square and 40 feet high, scagliola columns, and ceiling in the Inigo Jones style. So very much a geometrical square with a circle in the middle, very, very plain Inigo Jones style. Scagliola is this strange Italian thing where they ground down sort of marble and then gave it a pigment and set it in a sort of a binding agent. And then it became very hard, then polished it very well. And so you ended up with what looked like great sort of monoliths of marble, and actually they're not at all. It's a layer of this marble dust. So these columns here are not solid marble, they're scagliola. But it's a good example of the plainness of Palladianism. And the plasterwork here is by Jonathan and Joseph Rose, the great plasterers of the times. And the niches house 18th century statuary, the panels by James Stewart, and the overmantels by John Gibson. So on to the pinup of the Palladian era. So again, it's like a miniature version of Wentworth Woodhouse. This, of course, is Chiswick House in London, which I'm sure a few people have been to as well here. Lord Burlington built it. Some people were quite rude about it, including Lord Harvey. He said it was, I think, too small to live in, but too large to hang from his watch chain. but it was never meant to be lived in. It was the big house of Burlington was here. And of course, this descended to the Dukes of Devonshire. And this was always a little bit of a curiosity, this Palladian villa. And so it's funny how, again, something quite small, and then it can be something enormous like Wentworth Woodhouse. It was something which could be expanded and shrunk quite easily. So Lord Burlington, who built it, is probably the most famous British exponent of the Palladian style. And he built one of its most admired and copied buildings in 1729. And so this is only 4 years after the West Wing was built here. So different. It was not designed to be lived in, but as a private museum and gallery. And Burlington was an aristocrat with several large houses at his disposal, and his villa became the model for similar houses built for newly wealthy merchant class, which of course was springing out in 18th century England hugely. We go inside. So while the exteriors of Palladian houses in the country and town were sober and correct, the interiors of the grandest houses were still, as I discussed before, fairly Baroque. William Kent designed furniture to be an integral part of a decorative scheme, which was quite a novel idea too. Indeed, the early houses of the Georgian London were like their inhabitants, outwardly modest, but inwardly colourful, often magnificent, and probably fairly naughty. Palladio's original villas, like his houses and the Georgians built in a similar vein, were usually less grand than the townhouses of the wealthy who built them. Strict symmetry governed exteriors, and function certainly followed form, as opposed to earlier times. While Chiswick was almost pocket-sized, the Palladian model was used in some very palatial examples. Of course here, but here we see another very grand house, which I'm sure it's smaller than Wentworth Woodhouse, but it's still quite big. This is Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, built for the great Thomas Cook, 1st Earl of Leicester, from 1734. So very similar date. Well, it's the same date, isn't it, pretty much, as the Flitcroft wing here, under the supervision of the architect Matthew Bretting. At Holcombe, the scale is absolutely huge. The central block is flanked by 4 pavilions. So you can see clearly the 2 either side of the main block, but there are another 2 behind it as well. A plan derived from Palladio's Villa Mocenigo. The exterior of Holcombe, by normal Palladian standards, is particularly austere and plain. But we go inside and theatre happens again. While the exterior is subdued and built largely of brick, when we go inside, we find a cavernous and magnificent space, the Marble Hall. The ceiling is richly coffered, and the coffers are those sort of indented square or in this case, octagonal compartments in the ceiling. So in the hall, richly coffered ceiling and walls covered in Derbyshire alabaster. The form is taken from a Roman basilica. The ceiling is after Inigo Jones again, itself derived from the Pantheon in Rome. William Kent creates an interior that is rich, yet in this case, understated as well as rich, where the material on the walls and the paintings are given more prominence than architectural detailing on the walls. Carefully imagined scale, proportion, and detail bring the spaces to life. The walls of the saloon here are covered in patterned red kaffoy, which is a mixture of wool, linen, and silk, and I think it's still the original on the walls there. The style of the decorations used for the largest as well as the smallest rooms, which shows well how suited the Palladian style was to different scales. Oh, goodness. So what's going on at a similar time? At the same time as Palladianism was at its height, the flimsy delights of Strawberry Hill Gothic, or Gothic with a K, arrived with Horace Walpole's infamous Castle Fantasy, and with it the work of Sanderson Miller and the pattern books of the wonderfully named Batty Langley. Pattern books were things which, local craftsmen or stonemason could be given, and you say, I want to have a Gothic fireplace, or I want to have a, I don't know, Romanesque sort of this, or I mean, they were basically, if you didn't have a professional architect, you would get your mason to use a pattern book. So this is what's happening in London at Twickenham, or outside London, with Horace Walpole, something so different to the Palladian era. And of course, the Walpole family built Houghton Hall in Norfolk, which is a great Palladian house. So this strange place here, part a reaction against the strict diktats of Palladianism, as well as an expression of the new interest in antiquarianism and medieval scholarship. At Strawberry Hill, Horace Walpole created his own oeuvre of medieval architecture and design. A 14th century Gothic tomb at Westminster Abbey was the model for a chimney piece surrounding the library. And the bookshelves themselves have hinged and arched cusp surrounds based on drawings of pierced work from old St. Paul's Cathedral. And when you go there, you can see that they cover the books. So actually they're on hinges, so that you can pull these out. So it's very funny. It would have really annoyed a lot of people, especially the Palladians, because actually it's sort of taking original architecture and completely playing around with it, and turning a tomb canopy into the top of a fireplace. It's quite disrespectful in a way, but it's wonderfully fun. So Walpole, like the fantasy, Walpole's original small-scale ideas gradually morphed into bigger plans, and Strawberry Hill actually became a very large, rambling mansion that we see today. So if you haven't been to Strawberry Hill, you've got to go. It's surrounded by Chiswick House, Strawberry Hill, Zion House, Osterley, Ham House, Hampton Court. They're all within half an hour of each other. So you can sort of do pretty much Renaissance to Regency in a few days. So we've got to Gothic, and we'll then go inside a little bit further. The staircase on the left, amazing fretwork on the stairs, and then this is the ceiling of the long gallery, clearly taken from somewhere like King's College, Cambridge, or Sherborne Abbey, with the sort of fan vault type thing. And then the tribune on the right, the most exquisite of all the rooms. But oddly enough, quite a lot of the furniture was classical. So it's again a whole mix of things, and it's almost looking ahead to the Victorian confusion of styles, you know, which really, by the Victorian era, there are so many different styles, but we won't touch on that today. So during this time, Chinese Gothic styles ran parallel to Palladianism. Everything's going on. And here we see, that's Tissington Hall on the left with my daughter when she's nearly 3 now, so when she was very small. That's showing the fireplace from a design by Batty Langley, and then one of the pattern book type designs on the right. So Batty Langley, in his ancient architecture, restored and improved, they weren't very modest. They always thought they were better than people in the past. In 1741, he wrote that Gothic was established as a sort of indigenous version of Rococo, with romantic associations as an alternative to classicism. The new Gothic incorporated elements of chinoiserie and Indian designs to form a distinctly Rococo feel and a clear reaction to the Palladian box-like perfection. And let's now come to Wentworth Woodhouse. This is Needle's Eye in the park here. Quite a confusing folly, because I believe it was assumed to have been built in the sort of mid-18th century, but actually there is a picture of it earlier than that. But I personally think probably what happened with this 46-foot high sandstone block pyramid with an urn on top was actually they decided to put a Gothic arch through it, or maybe they changed the top of it into this OG design, which is that strange sort of curve with a point. But this is happening, probably designed by John Carr of York in the mid-18th century. So similar sort of time, a bit after Strawberry Hill. But this is really, I think, probably the only nod to 18th century Gothic here at Wentworth Woodhouse. I don't think there's anything in the house. But it may have been, as I say, a case of Gothicizing an earlier structure. The pyramid is pierced by this tall Gothic OG arch, and probably or possibly built as a result of a bet, I believe, in which the second Marquis here claimed he could drive his coach and horses through the eye of a needle. Maybe true, maybe not. And here we see quite a traditional looking Palladian box. This is Claydon House in Buckinghamshire. And there's no clue here to what lurks within. This was actually 1/3 of a very large house. The Verney family of Claydon wanted to challenge the Temple family at Stowe. And so they, as typical with people wanting to get rather ahead and above their station, they completely ran out of money. And so this wing was the one that was kept. So from 1759, the Verney family of Claydon commissioned extraordinary Rococo interiors within a standard Palladian structure. And the chinoiserie carving here is by Luke Lightfoot, one of the very finest carvers of the era. The Chinese room on the first floor, and you can see it here on the right, is one of the most extraordinary 18th century interiors anywhere. Carved royalty take tea under pagodas and temples, festooned with bells, oriental swells, and dragons. The high Baroque that the Palladians had shunned was reignited by Rococo elements creeping into these Palladian boxes. So it's hard to believe from the outside this is what's lurking within inside. And chinoiserie had captured the English imagination and has never really left. And I'm sure there must have been chinoiserie elements here, certainly in furniture back in the past. I mean, Wentworth Woodhouse would have had this mix within this Palladian box. So back to London, and a very important building, because this is really where the neoclassical style was born. This is Spencer House, built for the Spencer family, of course, ancestors of Princess Diana, and still owned by the Spencer family, but expertly restored under the watchful eye of its tenant, Lord Rothschild, Jacob Rothschild, and that's their offices. And I took a group there recently. You can book to go round, and it's wonderful. And it's perhaps, I think, the loveliest of all the London palaces. It was built from 1756 by John Vardy for John Spencer and his wife, Georgiana Poyntz. and Vardy had been a pupil of William Kent. James Athenian Stewart had newly returned from Greece, and he replaced Vardy as Lord Spencer's architect in 1758. And the house was the first example in London of the accurate use of actual Greek detail in interior decoration, making it one of the pioneer examples of the neoclassical style of architecture. So we'll go inside. On the left is the anteroom, again with a Jonesian type ceiling. We're seeing those so often. And then this idea of an apse on the right, very much with the ceiling of the Pantheon, but this time they've got it into diamond shapes rather than octagons. But we're going to say quite a contrast of rooms in this house. So on the left, John Vardy's apse is taken from the Temple of Venus in Rome, but on the right, a completely bizarre room designed in 1757, the Palm Room is as unrestrained as can be imagined. And again, this is within a sort of Palladian box, and quite unlike the usual Palladian interiors. Carved and gilded palm trees based on John Webb's design for the King's Bedchamber at Greenwich Palace, and the design had been attributed to Inigo Jones, so it was all right. So it's within the accepted bounds of Palladianism. The palm trees symbolize marital fertility and also the close connection between classical architecture and nature. The frieze of griffins and candelabra is derived from the temple of Antoninus and Faustina in Rome, and the griffin, luckily, is also the supporter for the Spencer family coat of arms. And the plasterwork is by Joseph Rose from the same family who did the plasterwork here. So the decorative eclecticism of the first half of the 18th century helped to forge significant aspects of the picturesque movement, which made the country houses of the mid-Georgians as much follies in a contrived landscape as practical structures. So this house, of course, is surrounded by extraordinary follies dotted around, different shapes. And the house itself becomes part of a sort of a Claudian type landscape. So it's a strange thing that everything is wonderful. It must have been wonderful to live in a time where architecture was built with such an idea of fantasy. And I think this is wonderful. So Wentworth Woodhouse, the house itself, almost one has to think of it as another landscape building within this park. So it all becomes part and parcel of a much bigger thing. And in this case, a huge estate here. So, as I was saying, the decorative eclecticism of the 18th century helped forge significant aspects of the picturesque movement. So this room here, which is very hard to photograph, so you really need to visit it yourself. This is the painted room at Spencer House in London, designed and painted in the antique manner by James Stewart, who became known as James Athenian Stewart, began in 1759, and the earliest complete neoclassical structure ensemble in Europe. So we were suddenly leading the way in Europe. We'd flirted with Baroque, we'd flirted with Rococoism. We'd, seen things through the eyes of Palladio, who was a Renaissance architect, but we were looking at it 200 years after his time. But the neoclassical style, where the architects and designers actually went straight to the actual classical examples rather than through Palladio, was a very, very exciting and new thing. And these rich men like Spencer, and later on the patrons of Robert Adam, would have these interiors with the most up-to-date findings from places like Pompeii or Herculaneum. So it was really showing off that they were up to date with these extraordinary classical findings being found on the Grand Tour, of course, which all the rich used to go and do these grand tours. So this room here, designed and painted in the antique manner, and very important because it used sources from Herculaneum, Rome, and Raphael's Vatican Loggia, and classical landscapes as seen in the paintings. The room celebrated the Spencers' marriage with Roman and Greek references derived from real examples, not just from Palladio. So the far-reaching style was based on scholarly research of classical sources seen firsthand in Italy and Greece rather than filtered through the eyes of Palladio, and that's the big change. So by the 1760s, we were in a period that marked us out as the stylistic leaders in Europe in the decorative arts. One only has to walk through somewhere like Zion House, where I was yesterday actually, to feel the confidence and harmony of neoclassicism. The architects and designers of mid-Georgian Britain started to embrace the wealth of their newly acquired knowledge brought back from Italy from excavations. The 1760s saw the demise of Rococo Gothic and the beginning and the end of the Rococo movement in general. The Palladian preoccupation with Italian Renaissance principles, which were derived from real classical examples, was superseded by the neoclassicists' insistence on influences straight from antiquity. Robert Adam, perhaps the most famous of the British neoclassical architects, had studied, drawn, and measured hundreds of classical buildings. He'd actually been there and looked at them so closely, some of which had only just been discovered. This was carried out under the guidance of the French architect Clarisseau and the master draftsman Piranesi. Piranesi's drawings of the ancient sites were so good that people often saw them in real life and were rather sort of disappointed, but they're rather magnificent and had this almost Baroque imagination to them. On Adam's return to England, he rapidly became the most sought-after architect of the 1760s to the 1780s, and his genius lay in the remodeling of interiors where he applied his own interpretation of the classical idiom. He brought these authentic classical schemes right into the heart of British domestic architecture. But he himself had been brought up in the bosom of Palladianism. His father, William Adam, a famous Scots architect, had been a successful Palladian architect and also understood the Baroque. So Adam's own style has mixed in with it the coolness of Palladianism and the theatricality and movement of the Baroque. And only now can we look back and try and sort of make a strict line where things happened artistically. This is where it happened. This is where Palladianism stops. And of course, it never was like that. Everything molded in. So you have somewhere like here, purely Palladian, and then you'll have another house with an extraordinary Rococo interior, which is also Palladian, but then with the Rococo. So it's all confusing. So from 1760 to 70, Adam enjoyed an unrivaled reign as a premier country house architect. At Zion House, he changed the Tudor Great Hall, which is what this was, into a cool, lofty, and elegant space by treating each wall as a classical elevation, using triumphal arches, coffered apses, and colonnades. And this room, he was very clever, Robert Adam, because he didn't often get to build something from scratch. So at Zion here, he has tricky problems with floor levels. So the anteroom through there is on a much earlier undercroft. So he's made us think it's on purpose that he's got these stairs, these steps leading up to it. The room is also very long. So he's got a screen there. So the room, you sort of read it not so long. It's also very tall and quite narrow. So he's put diagonals on the floor, which push it out, but then he's echoed the diagonals on the ceiling, which then ties it all in. So he was extremely clever. And all of these things, I went round with Hugh Petter and someone else. Hugh's an architect, and he's done a lot of studying on classical things. And he says each aspect of this interior scheme, all these little elements are taken straight from things Adam has seen and drawn right in ancient Rome. So it must have been so exciting, and it still is exciting. And here we see inside on the left, the anteroom at Zion, later on gilded by the third Duchess of Northumberland, because she basically blinged it all up in the 1820s and 30s to try and make it current, rather than tearing it down, thank goodness. But very important, because the favorite motif of the Arch of Constantine here in Rome on the right, Adam used it on an interior wall, which was really very unheard of at the time. And instead of what were slaves, stations of slaves across the top of it, he had gods and goddesses. Later, I think, gilded as well. But he was really very, very inventive. And this extraordinary floor made of scagliola, which we heard about in the hall columns, looking more like an encaustic tile from 1860 by George Gilbert Scott. So Adam was so inventive. And again, it's a wonderful spatial journey through Zion House. The Duke just said, I want the house to be turned into a palace of ancient Rome, which was that. I think that was the sort of the remit for Robert Adam. And the Arch of Constantine was something he also used when he built Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire. He put it right on the front of Kedleston Hall on the south front, and above it, the dome of the Pantheon. And later on, Sir John Soane, who was such a great follower of Adam in some ways. Well, he wasn't a follower, but he admired him, even though his architecture was so different. Soane would use the Arch of Constantine on his own house, Pitshanger Manor, in Ealing. So Adam was amazing, really. Went out of fashion, sadly, quite quickly. The red drawing room here boasts perhaps Adam's most expensive ceiling ever created. Also a chimney piece there, which has ormolu mounts on it, which was a very new idea, basically to try and make everything sparkle as much as possible. And then Adam, often people think that the ceiling and the floor need to echo each other. In this room, they don't at all. So he liked the idea of harmony in dissonance. So actually, you know, a bit like one of my friends is very into fashion, and he said that pattern on pattern is very, or was quite chic 10 years ago. You know, have a completely sort of pattern which never would go with something else normally, and apparently that was very chic. Anyway, Adam would do some similar sort of thing here. And on the left, you see the ceiling, the most expensive of its type ever commissioned by Robert Adam, from Robert Adam. 239 coffers painted by Cipriani with recently discovered classical scenes. And most famously at Zion, Adam tackled the problem of a long gallery, which we've got one. There's one here at Wentworth Woodhouse as well. I think the one here is more because this house is so big, it just needed a very long corridor. Here at Zion House, Adam had the problem of remodeling a much earlier long gallery from the Elizabethan house. And again, he used diagonals on the ceiling, originally on the floor as well. He put very, very tall, skinny pilasters along the wall, which pushed the height of the room up. It's 14 feet long, so 14 foot high, 14 feet wide, and 139 feet long. How that 1 foot must have annoyed him. If only it was 140 feet long, it would have been even better. But he was very, very clever, and he decided to use the idea of a long gallery as a columbarium, a catacomb, a family burial room. And so in somewhere like Hardwick Hall, the long gallery has all the family portraits of long dead family members. Here he's put them in little roundels around the top of the room and thought of it as this idea of a catacomb. So very original thinking. And of course, at the same time, the Industrial Revolution was, of course, steaming away by the second half of the 18th century, and overseas trade was hugely accelerating. And the Midlands and the North were the powerhouses. Good stuff, that drove these new industries, helped by their proximity to the coal mines. Well, this house knows about that as well. Cast iron was developed in Coalbrookdale in Shropshire and was used to build the railways and the iron bridges. Sheffield dominated the steel industry and developed silver plating. Cotton was woven, of course, in Manchester's dark satanic mills, and the dynamic Josiah Wedgwood built up a hugely successful business in Stoke-on-Trent. And here are some lovely examples of what this house would have had. Quite a lot of these houses would have had, of course, a lot of this, which we're very familiar with still. Jasperware, the Portland vase, and creamware. And his elegant cream and coloured queensware and jasperware are still in production today. So while Robert Adam enriched his building with classical motifs, Sir John Soane went even further to classical integrity. And he used the extraordinary color palettes of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as virtual reproductions of classical statuary. But Soane we're not going to touch on today, just because it's sort of this house, by the time Soane came along, this house had stopped its building phases. So we come back to this wonderful Georgian palace. And inside, for those of you, I'm sure many of you have been up this staircase, a wonderful imperial staircase here, going up to by John Carr of York. And John Carr of York was really the most fashionable architect of well, not just Northern England, the centre of England. He built, of course, he did work at Harwood, he did work all over the place. He worked for the Devonshires, of course, building the Crescent at Buxton, which has recently been restored and being used again. But this was created as a new neoclassical approach from the Hall of Many Pillars downstairs up to the Piano Nobile. And it's again, its decoration is already derived from classical sources. And it really feels more like ascending the stairs of a great London townhouse than this palace here. Outside, Carr created the palatial stable block, which I believe is a big part of the future of Wentworth Woodhouse. Almost as large as the house, really, isn't it? It's pretty big. As one would expect from a family whose horse was given pride of place in the whistle jacket room in their grandest stateroom, Wentworth Woodhouse has a magnificent neoclassical stable block built out of ashlar and dressed golden sandstone. And it was designed by John Carr of York and completed by 1782. 84 racehorses were kept here. There was a riding school, a saddlery, an inner courtyard with a huge fountain, and supplying water for the horses, of course. And grooms and stable boys slept above the horses, and some of the gardeners also slept here. So it's quite a busy building. So we finish where we began. The second Marquess of Rockingham also employed John Carr of York to further enrich the enormously long east front of Wentworth Woodhouse. He added extra stories and provided the porticos on the matching wings, each the equivalent of a grand country house in themselves. And then the final flourish, the left hand, this one's being restored. The left one is being restored, the pavilion. Again, you've got this almost Baroque flourishes here. So this is a lovely, lovely example of all of these different styles we've touched on. It's got the theatricality of the Baroque. It's got the coolness of the Palladianism in the center, and then the prettiness of the Neoclassicism on the left and right to form this 605-foot long facade at Wentworth Woodhouse. And as ever, Wentworth Woodhouse trumps them all as far as being the classical palace par excellence, as would have been expected from the Rockingham family, one of the greatest political dynasties of the 18th century. What is still so beguiling to me, though, is the fact that they kept the Baroque west wing, which was built in a style so disliked by the Whigs, and in so doing, created the wonderful double house that we all know and love today. So thank you very much. I hope that was an interesting sort of putting it in its context of other things that were going on around it, and not focusing directly on the house there, but just as see what was going on around it, because of course this house would have been at the forefront of fashion and intrigue and everything going on in the center of England in the north. So thank you very much. That's probably rather short.
Just before we take questions.
That was quite good timing, wasn't it?
Feet.
Oh, 606, sorry. Depends how big the feet are.
Has anybody got the lights on? Has anybody got questions for Ollie?
I try to answer them. I always say if I don't know something.
Got one from the online audience, Oliver.
Oh.
Great lecture, Oliver. Very interesting.
Oh,
Were local craftsmen used, or did they engage European workers to do the details?
Well, I believe, in the case of Wentworth Woodhouse?
Yes.
Well, the plasterers were the Rose family, so they were very much local. Well, they were not, I mean, they were English, and they worked all over the country, really from north to south. There would have been, like there has been recently, a whole works department of local artisans and craftsmen working at somewhere like Wentworth Woodhouse. You might have had one of the master carpenters or master masons supervising, but no, that I mean, and there, I as far as the Italian craftsmen, I'm sure there were certainly a few that worked directly here, but Flitcroft, Carr of York, and all of these people had very good works departments around them at the time. So I think there certainly would have been one or two foreign craftsmen here, but there would have been a lot of local talent brought in and nurtured and apprenticed to learn to work on a building like this, all managed by the architect at the top.
Very much what we're trying to reinstate today.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Because these houses have always been such catalysts, haven't they? Well, I mean, when Up Park burnt down in Sussex, that was restored entirely, the interior, by getting these dying crafts resuscitated in the nick of time. And then Clarendon Park, of course, burnt down as well, and that's still a ruin, and I don't know what's going to happen there. And so I think Wentworth Woodhouse is even more important now, because it's an example of a house that, yes, it's not falling down, but a house that can educate in so many ways.
And actually, even when the renovations are completed, there is always the need for ongoing maintenance.
Yes.
So having those skills, having an in-house team and having those skills, those local trades is so important, which is why we're concentrating so much on apprenticeships.
And your masons, they're the younger guys that have apprenticed to. Yeah. And had anyone been up to the roof? Yeah, it's amazing seeing those urns and things up there.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. but also must have been terrified when they started falling off, things like that.
Anybody else for a question for Oliver?
Probably all been sort of like talked at for another class. This room always fascinates me because I don't know how much the decoration is original.
Well, none of this.
No, I know that
this
isn't,
is
yeah,
this
but I
is
mean-
film set.
But the colours.
It's a lovely room, actually.
It's a
this.
beautiful room.
And actually,
yeah.
Whistle Jacket is directly above us. I think you thought
Oh,
thought it was
yes.
only there,
Oh,
but we're
no,
actually
sorry, I'm
directly
so
below
sorry, it is
Whistle
directly above
Jacket.
us. I'm being
Yeah.
dim. Yes, it
No,
is.
no, it's just
absolutely.
it's easy to lose your bearings.
No,
in
it
the
is.
place.
No, because this, yeah, this, of course, yes, of course it is. Sorry, we're
Yeah,
down here.
We're
aren't
down
we?
this way,
Yep.
and yes.
And I was thinking we're somewhere further down there.
Yeah.
But yeah, these rooms down here were sort of, these were much more family, sort of semi-state rooms, weren't they?
Mm.
Here.
Mm.
And here you've got the chapel. It's a very, very pure Palladian space. And then you've got in the Baroque wing, mainly that staircase area with those wonderful Baroque overdoors. That's the sort of clearest indicator of the Baroque interior. So I'm not sure there are that many Baroque bits remaining apart from
No, I
that,
don't.
really.
In terms of Baroque decoration, the staircase hall.
Yeah, that's the main thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
is the main hall.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated because there's a lot of panelling in that part of the building, room after room, full of panelling.
Yeah.
Would there be painted rooms perhaps behind the panel, do you think?
Is the paneling, is it quite sort of thick, sort of Balection paneling?
Yeah, it's largely raised and peeled panels.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, well then I don't know. I don't think so. Then I mean, there might have been a very important room at the centre of that west front above. I mean, but actually the staircase at the centre is the staircase hall. But so there can't have been actually then.
Mm.
Yeah.
There were three important libraries
On the right,
on the
yeah.
right,
And then it
So-
suddenly it shrinks the
Yeah.
width of it on the left. It's strange, isn't it? And then the long gallery, that's I think Flitcroft, isn't it? A sort of joining room. So it's just interesting seeing at Burley House a little bit earlier how the Baroque really was pretty wild. And if you go to Benningborough Hall in Yorkshire as well, that's got some pretty great Baroque spaces inside as well.
So which is your preference? Are you more of a Palladian man or a Baroque man?
One of my favourite houses is Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire, and that's by Vanbrugh. Well, part of it's by Vanbrugh, the back of it's sort of medieval, and that's got a Palladian dining room. It's got a Baroque hall. Does it have a neoclassical room too? No, it probably doesn't, but it's got elements of all of them, and I love the elements of all of them, and I think it's very interesting. The client, of course, like Wentworth Woodhouse, that these grand families will always have to try and stay in fashion and do the right thing. So they must have. So in this, that's why you've got a Baroque house, then a Palladian house, and a neoclassical house. So I'm not sure what my favourite is really. Actually, I like this house very much now.
Yes, this is the best house. That's why.
But I when I first came here, I read about it, and I've seen pictures of it, and I didn't think it was going to be a very friendly house. It kind of just looked to me. It looked to me, took an American group around Blenheim once, and they said, "Where are the bedrooms?" And I said, "Well, it's not got much room upstairs because it's got this one huge central hall." And they said, "This house," and it's a terrible thing, is a lot of fart and no shit. and I was thinking maybe Wentworth Woodhouse would be a bit like that, but it's not at all. It's a lot of shit, but in a good way. So it's a great house.
Okay, and is anybody else got anything else they'd like to ask before we finish?
Are there details where the stone comes from?
Is it local?
For here,
Hmm.
yeah, well, it's a mixture of stone. We have sandstone and limestone here. The limestone is Ketton,
Oh,
which
yes.
is actually from
Lincolnshire.
Stamford area.
Lincoln,
Yeah. So,
Very fine. Good stuff.
but yes, and virtually impossible to get hold of now. And we don't really know why it came from there. I think that
It was a very good building, Stone Castle.
yeah, and I think we sort of think that there may well have been family connections with the quarrying there, but yeah, so it's Ketton.
And Yorkstone anywhere, so must have been some of that too, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean,
Yeah, there were several local quarries, but I think we're bringing stone in from even as far as Nostell.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bringing it down.
And then the brick would have been made on the
Brick's made
estate.
locally,
Yeah,
yeah.
locally. Yeah,
Mm.
it's had brick kilns and furnaces and all that sort of thing.
It's quite interesting, there's lots of just doing a study of the materials
Mm.
in the house, obviously, because things change and things have been added, and yeah, it's varied.
It's wonderful. It's come
Yeah.
alive again.
Yeah.
Really
Can we
has.
thank you again, Oliver?
oh,
That
sorry,
was
sorry, what-
sorry, I missed you.
Would the black on the surface of the stonework have anything to do with the coal mine?
Yes.
And is it very difficult to get off?
Well, first of all, yes, it is to do with coal mining. The concern with cleaning it off, well, one of the questions I had when I came here is it damaging the building? And I've been assured by the experts that it's not. And so certainly within my, whilst I'm chief exec, I'm not interested particularly in removing it. I think it tells a very fantastic story about Wentworth. It's part of its DNA. This house was built on the profits from mining. So I think, and to be fair, there's lots of other things that we need to do on this house before making it shiny is top of the list. So I don't think as long as I'm the custodian, that it's going to be cleaned. But it's, it's a good, there are people on the board of trustees who would really love to see it clean. So, there's no right or wrong answer to that. But I think at the moment we've got higher priorities.
And it's not damaging, so it's good.
No, it's not damaging it. No. Okay, thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for coming all the way up to see us, Ollie.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.